The moment I stepped into the kitchen of the retirement home, feeling the warmth of the ovens and hearing the sizzle of pans, I found an unexpected refuge from the coldness at home. Gary, with his years on me and a possessiveness that tightened like a vice, had been making life unbearable. But here, in this whirlwind of culinary chaos, I found camaraderie with David. He was more than a mentor, he was a fellow soul navigating the rough seas of marriage and family life. Our conversations, tucked between the slicing of vegetables and the plating of meals, became the lifeline I hadn't known I needed. But peace, it seems, was a luxury. Gary's accusations started like a storm brewing on the horizon, distant at first, then all at once overwhelming. "I know you're seeing him," he'd hiss, voice laced with venom, eyes narrow with a jealousy so thick it suffocated. David was nothing but a friend, a colleague, but to Gary, he was the thief of affection he no longer claimed. My denials fell on deaf ears, and our home turned into a battlefield. Every accusation a grenade that blasted away bits of trust and love. In a bid to quell the storm, to prove our innocence, I suggested something simple, naive, perhaps an introduction via social media. "Let's show them how ridiculous this all is," I said to David over the phone, the plan sounding foolproof in my head. David agreed, his voice weary but hopeful. If our spouses saw how mundane, how professional our relationship was, perhaps the green-eyed monster would retreat, leaving us to salvage what was left of our marriages. Little did I know, this act of defense would set the stage for a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. Never in a million years did I think clicking send on that friend request would detonate our lives. But there it was, a digital match that lit a fuse hidden under the guise of strengthening ties. Gary and Lee, David's then wife, took that opening like a secret handshake into a world we never wanted to enter. It was supposed to be innocent, a way to smudge out the ridiculous accusations both our spouses hurled at us. Little did I know, it was the beginning of an elaborate dance of deception. "Let's just show them there's nothing to worry about," I had suggested to David, thinking a transparent connection between our spouses would quell the storm. Gary's obsession had reached boiling point, and this seemed like the only way out. "Absolutely," David agreed. "Transparency is key. If only we knew." The signs were subtle at first. Whispered phone calls, late nights at the office, and sudden weekend business trips. My gut twisted every time Gary mumbled another excuse. It was as if the man I married had morphed into a stranger, slinking around our home with a guilt I couldn't quite catch. Meanwhile, David and I, thrown apart by new job opportunities, drifted into silence. Life, with its uncanny ability to build walls between old friends, did just that. My marriage was crumbling, yet I was marooned on an island of solitude, unaware that David was navigating his own wreck. Then, like a cruel twist of fate, Gary's health plummeted. Terminal illness has a way of stripping down life to its bare bones, revealing the raw truths we'd rather not see. "Mourn me for 15 minutes, he'd said, a smirk playing on his lips, "but stay away from David." That comment haunted me, a puzzle piece that refused to fit until it was too late. The irony was thick enough to cut. Here I was, accused of turning my back on my marriage, while Gary had been orchestrating his own betrayal. And David, the supposed other man, was just as much in the dark as I was. Our spouses, united in deceit, had left us grappling with a reality that was about to come crashing down. Life has a funny way of throwing you back into the orbit of people who matter, just when you think you're drifting alone in space. That's exactly what happened with David and me, in the last place I'd have ever expected, the cluttered aisles of a local game store. I was there, trying to find some semblance of normalcy for my kid, when I heard a voice that yanked me back years. "Long time no see," David said, his smile warm but his eyes carrying stories I hadn't read. As we caught up, standing amidst shelves of video games and the echoes of digital battles, the weight of the years apart seemed to dissolve. David looked different, the kind of change that goes beyond the physical, etched deep by pain and loss. He shared his story with a bravery I couldn't help but admire, about how Lee's neglect had cost him not just his marriage but his leg. My heart ached for him. This man who had once been accused alongside me, now bearing scars from a battle he never chose to fight. The turn our lives had taken felt like something out of a movie, but there we were, finding solace in shared suffering. David's honesty brought us closer, his vulnerability breaking down walls I didn't even realize I had built. It was in those moments of shared stories and understood silences that our old friendship began to blossom into something more. We started seeing each other, tentatively at first, as if both scared to admit how right it felt. Then came Valentine's Day, a lunch date neither of us realized was on such a charged day until we were surrounded by couples lost in each other's eyes. It might have been the mood, the setting, or maybe just the right time. But that lunch marked the beginning of us, two people scarred by betrayal, finding a new path together. Our relationship wasn't just a rebellion against the past, it was our way of reclaiming our stories, of stitching together new memories from the tatters left by those we had trusted most. With David, I found not just a partner, but a fellow survivor, someone who understood the depths of pain and the heights of healing. Our journey wasn't easy, but then again, the most meaningful stories rarely are. Just when you think you've turned a new leaf, the past has a way of clawing its way back. I learned this the hard way, rummaging through old boxes that still smelled like the life Gary and I shared. It was supposed to be a cleansing ritual, a way to finally let go of him and all the hurt. Instead, I found his old phone, a relic I thought was lost, buried under layers of forgotten memories. Curiosity, that old traitor, nudged me to charge it up. And there it was, the Pandora's box of texts, photos, and voicemails that blew the lid off the lie I'd been living. Gary and Lee's affair wasn't just a rumor, it was a well-documented reality. I sat there, phone in hand, part hammering against my chest, torn between two agonizing choices. Telling David could shatter the fragile peace he'd built around his heart. But keeping this secret felt like a betrayal of its own, a shadow that could loom over us, threatening the trust we'd fought so hard to establish. The weight of the decision pressed down on me, a test of our relationship's resilience. David, we need to talk. I found myself saying later, my voice barely a whisper, trembling with the weight of the truth I was about to unload. His gaze, steady and understanding, encouraged me to continue. As the story spilled out, the color drained from his face, replaced by a storm of emotions that flickered too fast for me to read. The silence that followed was deafening, a chasm that threatened to swallow us whole. David's response was measured, a testament to the strength I'd always admired in him. I wish I could say I'm surprised, he finally said, his voice laced with a bitterness that wasn't directed at me. But thank you for telling me, we can't let their choices define us. The conversation that followed was a roller coaster, a tumultuous journey through anger, sadness, and eventually, a kind of acceptance. We were two people, bonded not just by love, but by the shared scars of our pasts, deciding to face the future together, no matter how uncertain it looked. The revelation of Gary and Lee's affair was a test, one that we could only pass by holding on to each other, choosing transparency over secrecy, and healing over hurt. The bombshell I dropped about Gary and Lee's affair might have been out in the open, but the fallout was a slow burn, eating away at the edges of David and me. It was like watching a crack creep its way through ice, silent but deadly. David, who'd always been my rock, suddenly seemed adrift, caught in a storm of his own making. His trust, that once unshakable foundation, now quivered under the weight of betrayal's long shadow. How do we move past this? He'd asked, his voice a mix of anger and desperation, a mirror to the turmoil churning inside me. The answer came not from running away, but from facing our demons head-on. We need to talk to Lee, I declared one evening, my resolve steeling. We need closure. David's nod, though hesitant, signaled our unspoken pact to weather this storm together. Arranging the confrontation was easy. Facing it was anything but. Lee's house stood as a monument to the life she and David once shared, a life now as shattered as the trust between us. The doors swung open, and there she was, the other half of our shared agony, her eyes wary yet defiant. The conversation ignited quickly, a volatile mix of accusation and defense. You had no right. David's voice boomed. every word a thunderclap of hurt and accusation. Lee's retorts were sharp, slicing through the tense air with claims of loneliness and abandonment. And you were perfect? She shot back, her words laced with venom. I watched, a silent arbiter, as the past and present collided, spilling secrets and pains long buried. It was a dance as old as time, love entangled with betrayal, each word a step closer to the brink. The heated exchange laid bare the raw, ugly wounds we each harbored, the kind that festered in the dark. Yet, amidst the chaos, a strange sense of clarity emerged. This confrontation, as painful as it was, served as a crucible, burning away the illusions we'd clung to. What was left was the stark truth of our situation, damaged, yes, but not beyond repair. It was a beginning, albeit a tumultuous one, to the healing we so desperately sought. In an instant, our quest for closure spiraled into chaos, turning a confrontation into a catastrophe we never saw coming. What began as a heated exchange with Lee abruptly shifted into a physical struggle, a frenzied attempt to quell the rising storm. But fate, cruel and unforgiving, had other plans. A misplaced step, a stumble, details blurred into a horrific tableau, culminating in Lee's fall. The sound of the impact was sickening, a final note in the symphony of our shared tragedy. There, on the cold floor, lay the stark, irreversible outcome of our actions. Lee motionless, her life a candle snuffed out in the gust of our tempest. The aftermath was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and the cold, impersonal questions of those tasked with piecing together the events. David and I, united in shock and despair, found ourselves navigating a nightmare of legal entanglements and moral reckonings. I never wanted this. I found myself whispering, over and over, a mantra against the tide of guilt that threatened to drown us. Our relationship, once a beacon of hope amid the ruins of our pasts, now bore the heavy chains of regret. The love that had blossomed in the aftermath of betrayal was tested in the crucible of guilt and recrimination. How do we get past this? David asked one night, the shadows of our cell-like room painting his face with grief. The question hung between us, heavy and unanswered. The trial was a spectacle, a public dissection of our lives and choices. Prosecutors painted us as villains, our pasts fodder for a narrative that cast a long shadow over the truth. Our communities, once havens of support and camaraderie, turned their backs, leaving us isolated in a desert of judgment and scorn. Every headline, every whisper of our names, was a reminder of the tragedy we'd unwittingly authored. The court of public opinion had reached its verdict long before the judge had spoken. Guilty, not just of the accident, but of every misstep that had led us here. Our reputations, painstakingly built, were now irrevocably tarnished. The stain of Lee's death a mark we could never erase. In the end, the legal judgment was almost secondary to the sentence we'd already imposed on ourselves. The prison of guilt was one from which there was no parole, its bars forged from the memories of a night that had changed everything. David and I, once survivors of betrayal, now found ourselves shipwrecked on the shoals of a tragedy of our own making. Our love story a cautionary tale whispered in the shadows of our once welcoming communities. Caught in the maelstrom of public condemnation and legal battles, desperation clutched at our hearts with icy fingers. The world we knew had crumbled, leaving us grappling in the ruins for any semblance of the life we once cherished. It was in this dark hour, with our backs against the wall, that David and I concocted a plan born out of despair. If we could just sway the evidence, tilt the scales in favor, David murmured one night, his voice a mixture of hope and desolation. It was a dangerous game we were considering, a dance with deceit in a bid to reclaim fragments of our former lives. The plan was simple yet fraught with risk. We would seek out key witnesses, those whose testimonies could damn us further or lend us a lifeline. It was a gamble, a play for redemption on a board set by fate. Yet, in our blinded state, the line between right and wrong had blurred, the ends justifying the means in our warped view. The turning point came in a shadowed alleyway, a clandestine meeting with a witness who held the power to alter our destiny. The air was thick with tension. Each word exchanged a loaded die cast in the game of chance. But fate, ever fickle, turned against us. The meeting erupted into chaos, a scuffle in the dark that ended with a scream, my own. Pain seared through me, a burning lance that heralded the shattering of more than just bone. In that instant, the cost of our gambit was laid bare. The loss of my leg a brutal testament to the depth of our fall. The aftermath was a blur of pain and recriminations. The hospital room a stark cell that mirrored the prison we had built around ourselves. David's face, once a beacon of strength and comfort, now seemed a mask of the stranger, guilt and sorrow etching deep lines around his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice a ghost of the man I once knew. But apologies were band-aids on a gushing wound. Our actions had set us on a path from which there was no return. Our relationship, once a bastion against the world's slings and arrows, began to crumble under the weight of our choices. The quest for vengeance had consumed us, leaving behind a chasm filled with the debris of trust and love. Conversations turned into confrontations. Our shared space a battleground scarred by regrets and what-ifs. In the cold light of day, the realization dawned on us that the battle we were fighting was not against the world, but against the darkness within ourselves. Our desperate bid for revenge had not only failed but had cost us dearly, both in flesh and spirit. The price of our folly was etched in the lines of our story, a cautionary tale of love besieged by the specters of guilt and betrayal. In a cruel twist of irony, the very plan we'd pinned our hopes on became our undoing. The legal system, with its cold, unyielding grasp, caught up with us, unraveling the desperate threads we'd woven in a bid to save ourselves. The verdict was a hammer blow, each word a nail in the coffin of our future. Imprisonment for David, house arrest for me, my disability the only thing sparing me from the cold bars of a cell. The gavel's fault echoed not just in the courtroom, but through the very core of our being, sealing our fate with the finality of a tomb. Lying in my hospital bed, a prison of another kind, I had nothing but time to reflect on the dizzying descent that had led us here. The room, sterile and impersonal, was a far cry from the life I once knew. It was here, amidst the beeping of machines and the muted steps of nurses, that the full weight of our actions settled on my shoulders. The realization was a bitter pill, each thought a sharp jab at the conscience I tried so hard to silence. We had been caught in a web of our own making, ensnared by choices that spiraled beyond our control, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. The loneliness was suffocating, a constant companion that reminded me of the cost of our folly. David, the man who had stood by me through the darkest of times, was now beyond my reach, locked away because of decisions we made together. The irony was a cold comfort, a reminder of how quickly the world you build can crumble under the weight of ill-fated choices. In the aftermath, the decision to leave the city was as much about escape as it was about survival. My heart, heavy with the scars of betrayal, guilt, and loss, yearned for a clean slate, a chance to rebuild from the ashes of a life consumed by vengeance. The city, with its labyrinthine streets and whispered rumors, held too many ghosts, too many memories of what had been and what could never be again. As I crossed the threshold of what had once been our home for the last time, the sense of finality washed over me. The suitcase in my hand was light, but the burden on my soul was anything but. The decision to leave was a vow to myself, a promise to seek redemption not in the eyes of others, but within the quiet recesses of my own heart. The journey ahead was uncertain, a path unmarked and shrouded in the mists of tomorrow. Yet, as I stepped into the embrace of the unknown, a fragile hope took root. It was time to let go of the past, to shed the cloak of lies, betrayal, and revenge that had defined my existence. The road to healing was long and fraught with challenges, but I was ready to face them, armed with the harsh lessons etched into my being. As the city receded into the distance, a chapter closed behind me, not with the bitterness of regret, but with the quiet resolve of acceptance. I was forever changed, scarred by the journey, yet buoyed by the promise of a new beginning. The legacy of our choices would always be a part of me,